I'm Laura Mize, pediatric speech-language pathologist, and welcome to Teach Me to Talk's podcast. Today we're going to be discussing something that's so important for every pediatric therapist to know, and it's how to spot the early signs of autism. Now, we're going to use information for this show from the National Institutes of Health and the CDC. And guess what, speech-language pathologists? It's the same information that we have on our own professional site at the American Speech and Hearing Association, or American Speech Language and Hearing Association, in our practice portal. So that gave me a great deal of confidence in how we are able to share this information with other team members who aren't in our field, as well as with parents. So I hope that you're going to enjoy this information. Now, you can get this in written form if you purchase CE credit and get a certificate so that you can use that for your own licensure or credentialing requirements. And you can find the link for that, the post for that, there in the description here as you're watching. So be sure to go ahead and get your CE credit so that you can have the handout so that you're able to use this information and really master it, because I think knowing these signs, these 8 signs or 9 signs that we're going to talk about today, are so important for us, again, in our own practices, so that we're really able, pardon me, from the beginning to distinguish children who have a speech delay, speech language delay, from kids who have something more seriously going on. Now today, for these indicators, again, we're going to specifically be talking about autism. So it's a great show, and if you haven't done so already, please go ahead and subscribe. All right, so let's move forward with looking at these early signs of autism. And again, one thing that we're going to do as we move through these signs is contrast the signs that we see for early signs of autism versus what we see in kids with speech delay. And I think that's so important for us as SLPs to know how to do, or other kinds of therapists, because those are the kinds of kids that we see on our caseload. We don't really contrast typically developing kids with autism. I mean, we do, but we kind of don't, because all of our references and all of our points of view kind of go to who's on our caseload. So how do we distinguish kids, again, that already have that delayed speech language development versus the kids who have a more serious developmental issue? And again, today we're specifically looking at autism. So we can use this list to really, on our own caseloads, to separate what's going on with our little friends. So this information is so helpful for parents too. So if you're a parent and you've tuned into the show, don't think this is just for therapists. I'm going to turn this off. This isn't a show that will help me. It absolutely will, especially if you are concerned about your own child having autism. And let me tell you the ways that you can use this. First of all, you're going to know what's atypical and what's not, and you're going to be able to do the same thing that therapists can do, is take this information and think, is this a speech delay or might this be autism? And then more importantly for parents, you are going to be able to take these specific indicators and say to your doctor, or if you're in a country outside the U.S. and you have a healthcare, whoever your healthcare provider is, you will be able to say, these are the really specific things that I'm concerned about. Now, why is that important? It's important so that your pediatrician does not blow you off. So many times parents tell me and every other therapist who's worked for more than 2 weeks, I took this concern to my doctor. I mentioned that my child was not talking, and I got just really kind of blown off and brushed off. He told me to wait and see. He told me wait till he's 2. And they would say things like, Laura, I've been talking to my doctor about this since my child turned 1. And so this is so important for parents. And so if you are a parent watching and you think, gosh, I wish I had a way to kind of look at that list, take yourself some notes, or you can get the handout too for that purchase with that continuing education package in our $5 CEU program. So again, I want to say one more thing specifically to parents. Just having a child who has 1 or 2 of these issues that we're going to talk about today will not mean that your child definitively will get a diagnosis of autism. If you want more information about getting that diagnosis and what the official diagnostic criteria is, you can watch or listen to show number 401, and I'll post that link below too, because that's really important information, and it walks through the DSM-5, which is the official way to diagnose autism. But today we're going to take a more informal look at this list or these characteristics, because I think that's where we start with parents, is really looking at these really easy to spot things. And this language is also that we're using today is not filled with professional terminology. And when it is, I'm going to do my very best to try to explain that so that we can have parents really understanding what we're trying to say. The other big thing for parents is, if you're watching this, when you see several of these things, we're going to run through 8 or 9 different things today, and when you see those things in your child, when you're seeing 4, 5, 6 of those things that you are identifying immediately, let me just say to you, please don't take a wait and see approach. When we are looking at a developmental disorder like autism, this is not something that a child will grow out of. It's not something that he or she is going to be able to just miraculously wake up or even over time catch up on their own. These are very serious developmental differences that we need to address. Now, the good news is when we address those things, when we get the right strategies in place, things change. Kids don't stay the same. And again, maturation is going to help us along with this, but it's not all that we need to do for a kid, a toddler or a preschooler who's showing these really early signs of autism. So if you are a parent, I want you to just throw out that inclination that I'm just going to wait this out, because waiting will actually waste more time for a child. So I wanted to go ahead and get that in there, but don't let that freak you out either, because early intervention is so beneficial not only for your child but for parents as well. You will learn how to do these strategies and take these interventions with you all day long. Now, these aren't these things that can just happen at school or in a therapist office, or even if you have a therapist coming to your home in a state early intervention program. But these are things that you can use as a mom and dad. Now, today we're not going to talk much about strategies, but please know that's what my entire channel and my entire website is about. It's helping you as a parent or as a professional learn how to address communication differences in very young children. Now, before we get started too, let me say one more word about early intervention. It is a child's best shot at fulfilling his or her highest, as we say, as a therapist, level of functioning. As a parent, you might think about just helping him or her be the very best version of themselves that they can be and reach that very highest developmental trajectory. And so getting services is so, so important, especially, again, like we said, when kids have the markers that we're going to talk about in this show today. Now, let me go ahead and address something that's so timely and that is just the biggest question that I hear parents talking about now, or when I receive emails that teach me to talk. Lots of parents are saying, is this delay caused by COVID? Pardon me. Is this my child's inability to talk, or all these missing milestones, especially with language, is it because he or she hasn't been around other children? Now, with a speech delay, that could be possible. It could be that because of the lockdowns that we've had with COVID over this past year and a half, that your child hasn't had the same social experiences, hasn't had the same cognitive experiences. His world has been smaller than it would have been had COVID and this worldwide pandemic not caused shutdowns across the globe. However, the things that we're going to talk about today don't really fit into that category. It's not really that lack of exposure that would cause the developmental differences that we are specifically going to address today. The things that we're going to talk about occur very naturally in a baby and toddler, young toddler's development. These are things that parents do not have to teach or train specifically. They just emerge as a baby grows and as a baby matures. And all the milestones that we're going to be talking about today occur before a baby turns 2. So in that first 24 months of life. And so please, as a parent, don't also kind of give that lockdown more of a priority position in your mind and the impact that it might have had on your family and on your child, don't let that talk you out of seeking professional assistance, or at the very least saying, gosh, this is not something that's due to COVID. These are very, very real developmental differences. And let's just go ahead and talk about that. When a child has autism, researchers tell us that their brains are actually wired differently. And we're going to talk about that as we move through these characteristics so that you can see and really it will talk about some of the specific brain structural differences that we see in kids who go on to be diagnosed with autism versus kids who have, again, that speech delay. And sometimes we'll talk about typical development when we're specifically addressing those brain changes as well. So because of that, we can really alleviate these concerns that COVID is why my child has these issues. Probably, most likely not. It's that those things were wired in. That would have happened anyway. Now, is that to say that environment doesn't impact a child's development? Absolutely not. And again, that's why intervention is so important, because we know that we can change how a child is developing with, again, therapy strategies that we're using, and more importantly, the things that you adapt as a parent at home. So let's go ahead and move through these differences so that as a parent, you can spot these in your own child, but as a professional, we can help parents see these things. And again, as a therapist, you're going to be able to use this not only for you, but when you're educating parents as well. And so this is a wonderful set of indicators, and you should really memorize these things. When somebody says to you, I'm concerned about this child having autism, it may not even be a parent, it might even be another team member, you should be able to just spout these off. So that's something that I would challenge you to do, is really memorize this list and really master and own this material so that you can provide the very best information for parents and for yourself, so that when you are sitting there and really evaluating a child, and even as you're working with a child, you start to see some of these things. Go through this list mentally and see, is this something I should be concerned about? Because the sooner we know that and start moving in that direction, the sooner a child will get the services and the support that he needs. Does this mean that every child who has markers for autism as a 2-year-old will eventually get that diagnosis? Thank God, no. That's why we do therapy, because we know that kids will get better. But again, let me caution you, it's not without specific intervention that we see kids really, really move forward. So let's go ahead and look at these early signs of autism. First of all, we see differences in eye contact and eye gaze. And so when we move through some of these indicators, you might think, what does that have to do with talking? Why is this speech pathologist talking about that? Because all interaction, all communication begins as a social exchange between people. And guess what? That happens not only with our words, but mostly with our nonverbal communication. So our body language and our facial expression. So here we're going to start up here with our eyes. And our eyes are so important for communicating information with other people. And so kids who have autism have differences in their eye contact and in their eye gaze. So let's just talk about what that means. What is that? Well, in general, it's difficulty paying attention to someone's face. And so when we see a little guy with autism, sometimes we notice these differences. Now, I worked with a team of people, and this was way back in the early 2000s, and when autism had just exploded in the 90s, and sometimes therapists would say, I don't think a child has autism because sometimes he looks at me. Don't get fooled by that. We need to talk about qualitative differences and quantitative differences when we're moving through these characteristics. So, and again, this might be a little technical for parents, but as a therapist, you need to help parents understand this. So what's a quantitative difference? It means that we see a difference in how often, the quantity that a child uses the milestone or uses the skill that we're going to talk about, or on the other side, does he often have difficulty making eye contact? Is it hard to get him to really look at your face? If you were playing with a toy with him, would he be more interested in the toy? If you were trying to give him a cookie, is his little is his eye contact, his little face, radar locked on that cookie rather than looking at you as you are giving it to him? And so eye contact is a really, really important part of social interaction. And again, it's how we get a lot of our communicative information. And so how does a child look at you? What we want to see is a child who can make and then maintain eye contact. So we want to see too, beyond that eager and expectant look. He's got little twinkly eyes when you start to play with him. He recognizes your routine. He remembers you. He loves you. He wants to interact with you. Now, is that to say that a child with autism isn't going to love a parent or love what you're doing? Absolutely not. It's just we're looking at this consistency. How well does he maintain that eye contact? How much is he looking at your face? Now, the second part of this is eye gaze. Now, eye gaze is when a child is using his little eyes to communicate a message to you and to share a message with you. So this, and again, these skills, eye contact and eye gaze, should be firmly established well before that child turns 1. So really at about that 6 to 9 month level, we should see children starting to use eye gaze when they are communicating with their parents. So what does that mean? That means that they are looking at something or looking at their parents and looking at something that they want. Say that they want a drink from mom's cup, and they're looking at mom and then looking at the cup and looking at mom and then looking back, or vice versa, so that they are shifting that eye gaze between an object and another adult or another kid or somebody else. We have to have those 3 points of contact when we're looking at joint attention. And so when we have kids that aren't shifting their eye gaze like that, or we'll talk about joint attention in a minute, where when we say, look, what do we want a kid to do? We want him to follow our point and look at what we're talking about. And so when we see kids that aren't doing that, autism is just that number one thing we should immediately start to think about a child. And again, is this going to say every kid who doesn't make eye contact with you is on the autism spectrum? No. And as we're going to talk about later, sometimes kids with speech language delays do have some differences with eye contact when we're looking at this quantitative and qualitative measure, but most of the time that's going to be a real important marker for us as therapists. How often is this kid looking at us? And let me say one more thing. We will see qualitative differences with kids when they are with their immediate families versus when they are with someone else that's not as familiar to them, or even a stranger, someone that they're first meeting. And so a lot of times parents will notice that and will say, well, he's fine because he's better with me. We really can't look at all of these indicators with just the child and his primary caregiver, because he's naturally going to be more connected to his mom or his dad, or again, whoever happens to be his primary caregiver. It might be or a caregiver, an important caregiver. So say his teacher at daycare. And so we need to really look at these differences too, and we can't always use how an infant or a toddler or preschooler, just their interaction with their parents isn't always what we're going to be looking at. We're going to see how they also interact with other people, namely other adults who are good with kids, who can spot these differences too, and say, that's something that I see him doing that with you, but I don't really see much evidence of that with other people. And again, you might be able to use some of those quantitative and qualitative differences with, mommy still kind of has fleeting eye contact with you, even though he looks at you sometimes when he's playing with you. It's still not the same kind of quantity or quality that we would want to see. And so again, let me give you some of these other questions. And these are the questions that I use when I'm thinking about eye contact and eye gaze with parents during sessions. So I've already mentioned the first one. Did a child have fleeting eye contact? Meaning he looks at you, he looks away. He looks at you, he looks away. He looks at you kind of by accident as he's running through the room. That's fleeting eye contact. Or what about kind of the peripheral eye contact, where kids are looking from the side? And we'll talk about that in just a minute, what that might mean for kids with autism. What about the kids that seem to, again, look sort of at us, but they're sort of looking above our heads? Or sometimes I feel like they're looking through me, but they're not really sharing that experience with me. It's not like our eyes have locked and that we're really on the same page. And so those are things we can look at. I've already mentioned the child that looks at objects more than people. That's not really something that we want to see or really facilitate with kids. We want them looking right here because they learn language from people, not from objects. And so we've got to get that social connection going. So let me give you a couple studies that talk about this. There's a study by Rowan in 2013 that talked about visual information in autism and how it's different in the brain of a child who will go on to be diagnosed with autism versus a typically developing kid. And so we usually think about this lack of eye contact, as I've already described it, as a social interaction issue. But researchers are telling us now that it's really might have more to do with a child's wiring, his mirror neurons. Now, what are mirror neurons? They are the structure in your brain that make you want to copy what somebody else does. And so we even do this as adults. If we were sitting here talking and my legs were crossed, you might unconsciously, subconsciously cross your legs too. Or if I am smiling, you're probably going to smile too. And so that's one of the things that, again, it's hardwired in, that connectedness to other people. And we get that through our mirror neurons. Now, kids with autism don't have that strong, they're not as strong. And so those are weaker. So weaker structural, I guess we wouldn't say structural differences. It would be a behavioral difference because of that structural change. And so we have to think about that with autism. There's a difference that's already there. And so another big difference that we see because of that and because of this brain difference in kids who go on to be diagnosed with autism would be in their social referencing. And this is a real important differentiation with teasing out kids who are shy and toddlers who are shy versus toddlers who have that more serious developmental difference going on. And so when we look at social referencing, this is how often a child kind of checks in with his mom or whoever is his familiar, whoever is his person when he's with you. Let's say grandma brings the child to his or her or anything. Let's don't even think about it as a therapy session. Let's think about it as just any other kind of community outing. And so his grandmother is his person that's with him at the park. And so when he's playing at the park, he's playing on the slide, he's going over to the sandbox, he's running under the playhouse structure. What is a typically developing kid do, and even a kid with speech language delay? What do? They are constantly or pretty frequently, pretty consistently looking for their caregiver. So if grandma is over parked on the bench, even an 18-month-old, a 2-year-old is going to try to scan to find grandma and make eye contact with her or check in with her visually as if to say, am I okay? Are you okay? Is all this going down? I just want to make sure you're here with me. So that social referencing is a big thing. And kids with autism will not do that with the same degree of frequency with eye contact, using eye contact, as kids that are typically developing or even kids with speech language delay. So look for that. Lots of times kids with autism seem to be pretty self-absorbed, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that they self-isolate. They are so into what is going on right in front of their little eyes and in their little brains that they really seem to shut out outside input. And so social referencing is affected by that. They are not going to look at their moms for reassurance or for comfort or for confirmation, like, am I about to get in trouble here? They don't do that. And so that's certainly something that we can look at there. All right, so we talked about how important this social connection is to get going. And that's why looking at eye contact and eye gaze and seeing how important that is for language development. Now, I forgot to tell you something about joint attention when we were talking about that. The reason that we want kids to have good joint attention is because that's how they link meaning. So when we say have a ball here, let's pretend that I have a ball here in my hand and I'm saying, look, ball, see, let's play ball. That's how a kid learns the word ball. And that's how he learns to link meaning with what I'm saying to what he's seeing. And so when we see kids who have diminished joint attention, meaning that when we show them something or when we're trying to redirect their attention, and I'm sure you've had that experience as a parent if you are worried about this, you're trying to show your kid something and he's doing everything he can to get down or get away from you, or maybe he's so engaged and engrossed in what he's doing that when you say, look, he doesn't look up. It is so difficult to get his attention. And so that's why this is important, because they are missing language learning opportunities. And as an SLP, you have got to talk to parents about that and say, this is why joint attention is so important. It does not matter how much we talk to him if he's not seeing what we're talking about and linking meaning with that. And so that's certainly a way that I've found to make joint attention really, really important for parents, so that they get, oh, that's why he's not learning words as fast as other kids his age, because his attention is not there. And it's not just attention, because sometimes those parents will say, well, he can watch a 2.5 hour movie in one sitting without moving. It's not attention, it's the specific ability to be able to shift his attention and then to use that eye contact, eye gaze, to share that experience with you. All right, let's move on to the second indicator. And I tell you what, these markers are so important. I could probably do a show about each one of them independently, but I'm just going to try to move through this list. And if you want a more scholarly or academic review of these, let me direct you to my podcast show number 1000, because that's where we really look at this as more research-based than we're doing in this show. But I wanted to let you know that that's there if you want some more detailed review of these things that might be more specific to a therapist or a professional than it would be to a parent. But let's move on and continue to use our parent terminology here. All right, number 2, what's our second early sign of autism? It's the inconsistency in responding to a child's own name. So a child has inconsistency or just lack of, meaning it takes forever to get him to look at you when you were calling his name. He seems to ignore you. So if he is with you and he's over doing something on his own, playing with blocks, or let's say there's a little girl who's just over there in her pretend kitchen and she is just playing, and you might call her Layla. It may take 15 times to get her attention, and even after then, she may look at you for a second and then go right back to what she's doing. Kids typically respond to their names well by their first birthdays. So if you have a child who's 16 months, 19 months, 3, who is not responding to his or her own name, that's a big marker for autism. And it's totally different than kids who have other kinds of speech language delays. They typically will respond to their names. And let's talk about this just from a language perspective, because you might be thinking, even as an SLP, what about kids with a receptive language delay? Wouldn't they have a hard time too, because they're not processing that incoming auditory information or what they hear? Yes, but no. And why do we know that? We know that when we have delays, it's just a matter of time, meaning the milestones are coming in, it's just slow. And so those kids, because they're delayed, they do start to respond to their names. And again, let me say, that 12-month time frame that I gave you there, that's the outside of normal, because typically developing babies begin to alert to their own names when they're between 4 and 6 months. And so certainly that extra 6 months of time by the time they're 12 months old, we have even given the kids who are naturally slower to develop, slower to walk, slower to talk, just slower to turn over, just everything was a little bit slower. We've already buffered that. We've given them that extra time when we're looking at that 12-month time, or that 12-month age there. And so big difference there. So when we see a kid who's not consistently responding to his or her own name, that's a big marker for autism. And it's certainly something that we as SLPs should be talking to parents about, or certainly just even before we have those initial conversations with parents about autism, which can produce shaky knees, and even those of us who've had hundreds of those kinds of conversations. So that's certainly something we should look at. And for yourselves, you should know autism is something I need to be concerned about, because this child does not respond to his or her name, and they are over that first birthday. So I want you to really just hold that piece of information in your minds. And if you don't retain one thing from this podcast today, accept that will be okay, because responding to your own name is such a big marker for kids who will go on to be diagnosed with autism. All right, let's move on and talk about this third indicator here, and that's a kid who does not point to or show other people what they're interested in, so their object of interest, their treasure, by the time they're 15 months old, and don't point to redirect someone's attention to that by 15 months. Now, at the beginning, remember what we talked about with eye contact and eye gaze, and we're talking about joint attention, and that we were talking about they don't look when we point. Now it's time, when we said by 15 months, they should be doing that. They should be initiating with us. They should be routinely bringing us things. And if you're a mom of a child with a speech delay, you probably have already this might be one that you just say, well, no, my kid can't talk, but he's constantly all over me for me to look at what he wants to show me, or for me to do what he wants me to do. And kids with autism have a really hard time with this. Now, let me say, the exclusion to this would be a child with autism, a kid with a toddler who he's a little bit further up the developmental rung, because he's not pointing and showing mom and dad something that he wants, but he might be leading a parent to what he wants. And so sometimes parents will say, well, he's not doing that, but you know what he does do, Laura? He takes me to whatever he wants me to do. And so here's the kicker. Is all that leading, is that just physical manipulation? Is he just taking you? Maybe he even will take your hand to operate a toy. But we have to see a social component to that. And remember how much we already talked about eye contact and eye gaze. So when a kid is just using what I call the big hand, meaning that he's taken his little hand to reach out to that big hand and pull you to the refrigerator, or get you to take your hand and get you to push the button on the toy, or it's usually something harder than that. It's usually something that he can't figure out to do. Maybe open the latch to the barn door that he's playing with, or get the race car firmly on the racetrack. Let's say there's a little lever there or something. That's when a kid with autism might take your hand to do it. And so what would be missing there? It's going to be that request. So either that nonverbal request with their eyes, like we were talking about before, that social connection there, or not really social referencing, but when he makes eye contact with you, as if to say, will you please do this for me? I'm having a hard time. Can't you see me struggling? Or, looking at you, looking back at the toy, looking at you, looking back at the toy, like, hey, help me out here. This is what I want you to do. And so we don't see that with kids with autism. So can you see how these things are already kind of piling up? The eye contact piece is not there, and then he doesn't really point to redirect your attention, like, look up there, Mom, it's that cereal. That's the cereal that I want. And then he's pointing at that cereal and pointing, looking back at you. So coordinating his eye contact with his gesture, that's a really, really important, complex series of actions that toddlers with typical development and kids with speech language delay learn how to do. And again, without much training or prompting or teaching on your part. So this is really an important indicator for us that we know. And again, I think it goes back to that brain difference that we've already talked about. Just there are structural differences there, so that social interaction and doing these things that are social, looking at what you want them to look at, or showing you something, initiating with you, they just don't have the same kinds of connections initially. Now again, when I say these negative things, I always want to say, but we can teach kids how to do this. Will it mean that they will or won't get an autism diagnosis? Sometimes we see so much progress in children in early intervention that they've had some of these markers, especially when they are mild, when the severity level is not the most severe that we've seen, when they're just mild little issues. Sometimes we can do that in early intervention, and so that is wonderful. But lots of times, again, these things will persist even after a child begins therapy, because they are so ingrained, because we talked about those neurological differences. And so we also, when we're talking about these things, you might say, well, my child's not showing me anything because he can't talk to me yet. He can't say anything yet. So he's not going to point to show me something because he doesn't have the words for it. That's not true. Kids with speech language delay and typically developing kids use gestures and use their eye contact and their body language to compensate when they don't have words. So it is a myth that or a lie that a child would not be able to use these nonverbal ways to communicate and use these nonverbal ways to initiate social interaction with you without words. He does. And we have to take the verbal piece out of this for parents. And we have to say, these are nonverbal things. These are behaviors that we're looking at that let us know that language is likely to develop, or with these signs of early autism that we're looking at today, not likely to develop unless we do some things and change some things. So that's certainly something I wanted to talk about, is taking that verbal piece out for when we're talking about these kinds of things with parents. All right, let's look at the fourth sign of autism in young children, and that would be differences in their play skills. So particularly pretend play. So when we don't see a child, well, let's back up a little bit. There's actually a marker before that. It's that kids aren't using familiar objects correctly before age 15 months. So what do I mean by that? I would mean that if a kid sees a hairbrush, he knows to pick up that hairbrush and brush his hair with it. Or when he sees a cup, he knows to pick it up and put it to his mouth. Therein lies the problem. Lots of times parents will see those things and they will say, he's pretending he's doing that, when really he's just demonstrating that functional object use. And how can you tell with this? It's because when we look at a kid with other kinds of play, we don't see any evidence of that true pretending, such as not only trying to give themselves a drink when they see a cup, which would be, even if it's empty, and that's why parents think they're pretending. They think they're pretending to drink from that cup because the cup's empty and they should know that there's not a drink there, That's not it. It's that the kid would we know they're pretending when they take the cup and then try to make you take a drink, or when they take a cup really and try to make a teddy bear take a drink. And so that's what we want to see, is that taking that not only do I know how to use that object, and that needs to be established by 15 months when things are moving along correctly in typical language development, or even in a speech delay. A lot of times we'll see, or language delay, we'll see kids who their play skills are wonderful. They're just not talking. And so this is going to be something that we can really, really look at. And that pretending piece, being able to, the example that I used before, give the teddy bear a drink, that should be coming in by 2. And the truth is, lots of typically developing toddlers start to do that around 18 months. It may be even earlier when we talk about earlier kinds of imitation. I'll give you some examples of that as we proceed. However, we want to really, really look at that. And the other thing that I want to say about this, especially for therapists, if you are trying to decide, is this kid really pretending, and you're thinking, well, that might be pretend, you've got to always look at how does he spend the rest of his time. Let's look at the totality of his play skills. So what are the other kinds of things? If he spends the rest of his time doing mostly exploratory play, meaning he's just kind of roaming around, looking at something, looking at it for a few seconds, maybe not doing much with it, just kind of looking at it, just exploring it, or maybe he's still putting it in his mouth a lot. Or maybe there's a kid who, again, just sticks to his preferred toy. We're going to talk about fascinations and obsessions in a few minutes as a marker too. So a kid who just stays so locked into what he wants to do, doing his own thing. Those kids probably aren't pretending either, because their focus is so restricted. What about kids who are just sticking to those earlier kinds of play, like strictly cause and effect, meaning I push the button, something happens, that's great. I set it back up, I push the button, something happens, that's great. That kind of thing, where a kid has to do something to get something, those kinds of toys, and they're usually a button or it might not be. Let's think about like a ball and hammer hammer toy, where a child is using a hammer to hit the balls to go down the ramp and come out the door at the bottom of the toy. Those are really cause and effect toys. Or things like constructive toys, where all they want to do is stack the blocks, knock them down again, stack the blocks, knock them down again. Or any kind of toy where it would be that repetitive factor. That's not true pretending. Those kinds of play are so important, and I will not dismiss the importance of those early kinds of play, but kids should progress and mature past that. And so when we see a child who's not pretending, we know they're going to have trouble with language development. Now, how can I say that? How can I make that connection? That's because when kids pretend, they're becoming symbolic, meaning that this thing represents something else. So you might see a little girl, let's say, or a boy, who would be outside, and you are playing with, let's use an example like the kitchen again. So let's say that you are pretending with a little pretend kitchen out there. Let's say there's a little grill. You've gotten a little boy a grill, and he's pretending with this pretend grill like Dad's big grill out there. He doesn't have a flipper. So what might he do? He might pick up a stick and put it on that grill and act like he is flipping something. Like that has just become his spatula there, or his flipper, whatever you call it. And so that would be an example of symbolism. He's pretending. So can you see how that's the same thing? That stick is representing a spatula, a flipper to that kid, rather than it's a stick. And so when kids can't do that, we're not going to see that pretending. So what's the language connection here? Words are symbols. So when we don't see pretend play, we know that a kid is having a difficult time being symbolic. So when he's having a difficult time being symbolic, we also know he's going to have a hard time with words, and with using words, and having something else to represent something else. And we used that example of ball before. Is a ball, that round bouncy thing that we all call a ball, is that really a ball? No, that's just the word that we've come up for. That's just the symbol in English that represents what that object is. And so same thing with pretending. Those cognitive skills are really one and the same. You know, we just see different offshoots of that. When I'm symbolic, I can use language to represent what I'm thinking about. I can use language to talk about what these real objects are. And an offshoot of that with what I do with that is I pretend, I use something to represent something else. And we see a good example of this when a kid, let's go back to that teddy bear example. Let's say that sometimes we'll see a kid, we know that he's really, really pretending when he doesn't have a cup, but he's got his teddy bear. He uses his little hand to pretend that that's the cup or the bottle for the teddy bear. And so it's such an important milestone. And sometimes as therapists, we miss it. A parent will give us some information. We'll say, how does he pretend? And they say, oh yeah, he pretends great. We've got to go beyond that and say, give me some examples. Let's talk about how he plays. Even more than that, we should be watching children play and making those observations so that we can see it with our own eyes. And I'll tell you a story that kind of has to do with this kind of thing with missing pretend play, because parents can misreport it even when they they don't understand, they don't know what they're doing. And so sometimes, this was years ago, and I've thought about this little girl a lot during the presentation because I've used her name already, and I've already used the word spatula, so this example is really, really fresh on my mind today. But this little girl who did go on to be diagnosed with autism, I talked with mom the very first visit about what kind of play she was doing, and she said, oh, she's a lot of pretend play. And I said, oh, well, talk to me about that. And she said she likes to make pancakes. Now, anytime a mom says something that complex for a toddler, when the report is she's not talking and she's not understanding very many words, she's not following a lot of directions, there's a mismatch there. So I naturally thought, I got to see this. And so I said, let me see that. Let's just watch her play. And so we, go over and start to watch her play. And sure enough, she takes her little spatula, but you know what she does with it? She holds it up to the light there in the room, and then she starts turning it, and mom says, see, she's flipping pancakes. And so as a therapist, we have to know those things. We have to know, sometimes what a mom is reporting or what a mom has interpreted may not be the same way that we would interpret that. And so do we slam mom right there and say, that's not pretending, that's self-stimulation? Absolutely not. But we do walk mom through that, and we do help her see, maybe not even in that time, that specific moment in time, in that specific session, but we help her see other things where her child might be getting some visual self-stimulation, which we're going to talk about in a minute too. But, parents make those mistakes. When a child is on his tummy on the floor, rolling his train and just rolling Thomas back and forth, they might, think he's got an elaborate play scheme going on in his mind, and he's thinking about the episode of Thomas that he watched yesterday, and he's acting that out. And honestly, do we really know that that's not going on? No. But we can look at his other kinds of play behaviors and say that was really self-stimulatory play, because I'm not seeing any other kinds of more advanced pretending here in his play. So go beyond asking about pretend play. See it for yourself so that you can tease out these differences with kids. And here's another reason this is so important. When we as therapists miss these delays or differences, or however you want to think about it, disorders, when we miss these markers that things are not moving along, and again, these would be things beyond talking, we start out working in a child with a level that is too far advanced beyond where he is currently functioning to be successful. And so when you think a kid is pretending when he's not, you're probably going to introduce the wrong kinds of toys in therapy. And so you might be thinking, or make, even worse, make the wrong kinds of recommendations to his parents about what they should be doing with him at home. You've started way up here when he's way down here. It's like taking a 7th grader who is just mastering multiple step math and thinking, I'm going to throw them in that 9th grade algebra class. And so even though they might have some components of algebra, they're 2 years away from that being where they what they should be learning there. So it's the same thing with us as therapists, and we can take that example and pull it back down to the toddler preschool level. If we think a child is already way up here pretending, we're going to miss a whole lot of things that we should teach, especially about play, to get him there. And then that's really a disservice to that child. So we've got to really just do everything we can not to overestimate a child's skills so that we stay working with him at that level where he can really make success. When we bump up too far, kids' progress will stall right where they are. Or worse, they will regress, because we're doing things that are just beyond what they can do. And so we want to really, really be careful of that as professionals, so that we're always really watching that. And play is a big, big area where that happens. All right, the 5th characteristic, or the 5th early sign of autism in a toddler or preschooler, is a kid who can't imitate. And so that's a kid who can't watch and copy other people's actions and body movements. The big thing here, the example, is waving by 12 months. And so that's certainly something that by 1, we should see those gestures coming in. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But when we don't see kids begin to copy other people, that's a big red flag, because that's how kids learn how to talk. They hear other people say the word and then they imitate it. But it doesn't start there. You don't have a kid that just begins to imitate words out of the blue. We see him imitating at those earlier, easier levels. So he's really going to learn how to imitate actions or copy his parents' routines. And so this would be a child, I talked about this earlier, one early play skill when we see that kids are really moving along with this and they're really bumping up from that just constructive or cause and effect play. When they start to do a lot of these little early pretending things, we'll see kind of early housework activities come in. 17, 18 months old, a child will start to copy you. You have washed his high chair tray so many times that now he's developmentally ready. When he sees that dishcloth that you have there ready to do that, he gets it and starts to do it himself. Or I have a really cute video that I show in one of the courses that I teach, where a little girl has taken just the picnic cloth from a cute little Melissa and Doug picnic set, and she takes it and she starts to dust her living room like she's seen her mom do over and over. And so we have to really think about how important imitation is when a kid's learning how to talk. He doesn't just start with words. You've got to see evidences that he's watching you and he's doing what you do. And that's how all of us learn anything. I mean, if you're watching now on YouTube, that's what you're doing. You are watching this so you can do something different. So imitation is so, so important. And so that's why we want to really, really look at imitation. Now, some of the lists lists that I referenced earlier, lists from the NIH or lists from the CDC, don't necessarily include imitation on their early signs of autism list. And why? Because it's embedded. So when a kid isn't waving or using some of these other things that we're going to talk about with gestures in a minute, or even doing some of the other things with play, how does he learn how to imitate play? Or how does he learn how to play? He imitates. And so even though imitation may not be spelled out on some of these other lists as clearly as it is on our SLP research about autism, it's there. And so it's certainly something that we should be talking to parents about. And so we talked about actions. Kids also learn how to imitate those gestures. So when we see a kid by 12 months who's not doing cute little things like, blowing kisses back at you or shaking his head yes or no because he's seen you do that a million times for yes or no, we know that's a big red flag or big marker. Also, when we talk about the imitation piece for language, we want to see kids imitating sounds and words by 16 to 18 months. So if you're not seeing that go down with a 24-month-old or with a 30-month-old, we know that's a big marker for autism too. And think back to what we said about that. That's because that mirror neuron difference there. They're not looking at you for eye contact, and then they're not watching you long enough to know, hey, I need to do what they do. And so that's certainly a big missing piece that we'll see a lot, and it's an early sign of autism. And let's contrast this with kids with just speech language delays. Sometimes those kids try to imitate everything except words. So they're doing great copying their parents' little routines. You'll see a kid, maybe you'll pull out a mirror in therapy and you might see a 2.5-year-old start to rub his face, and you look at him like, what are you doing? And mom says, oh my gosh, he does this at home too. You know what he's doing? He's shaving like his daddy. That's what his daddy does in the mirror, and boy, he has just started doing that. And so when we see kids that are doing that, we think, they're still not talking, but guess what? They are imitating. And so that's a really important differentiation. Now, will we have kids with other kinds of speech language delays who will struggle with imitation? Absolutely. Kids with cognitive delays will struggle with imitation. Kids with motor delays will struggle with imitation because of the motoric piece there. You're asking them to do something with their bodies, and that's hard for them to coordinate. Certainly kids with apraxia, suspected childhood apraxia of speech, that's one of the markers for apraxia. And we're looking at early signs of autism. Let me just go on and say there's some studies that say up to 60, I think it's specifically 63% of kids with autism may also have apraxia. And so when we think about that motor planning piece, that they just can't get that motor imitation piece going, that's consistent with apraxia. Now, when we say apraxia too, sometimes parents will cling to that apraxia diagnosis as a child's only problem when there are other issues too. So when we have seen the other issues like that diminished social interaction piece that we measure with eye contact and with joint attention, we know, autism is the culprit here. That's what's going on with this kid, because there's social differences too. With apraxia, we don't see the social differences. We don't see the differences in pretend play, because cognitively, again, if it's just standalone apraxia, cognition is intact. Those kids, play should be moving along. That shouldn't be a problem at all. And even with gestures, a lot of times those kids will come up with elaborate compensations for what they can't say. And so you can't really look at those other things. So when we're seeing the social piece, it's not just apraxia. So I wanted to mention that too. All right, imitation does emerge so just naturally without any kind of teaching. And so in kids with typical development, and again, even in kids with speech language delays, right up until we get kind of to the talking piece. So that's certainly something that we as SLPs and other therapists should be teasing out too. All right, number 6 on this list, differences in nonverbal communication. So these would be kids who do not understand and use a variety of gestures by 16 months. So this would be a kid who doesn't point, who doesn't reach, wave, clap, push, or pull purposefully to communicate what he wants. This would be a kid who doesn't really pay attention when you're using gestures. And how many times have we already talked about that today? That when you're pointing at something, they don't necessarily look at it right away, or you have to work so hard, and then you have to keep their attention there. They're just kind of gone after that. And so we have to really look at these differences in nonverbal communication. It also means that a kid doesn't read your own facial expressions. And so you might have a kid that you're working with as a therapist in therapy that there's some behavioral things that are going down that you need to address. And so you may be getting, or let's use a mom. It'll be easier for a mom, because I'm not going to say that a therapist is going to yell at a kid. But let's say that a mom has just had it with her kid because he will not listen to her. And he's not even realizing by her tone of voice, by her mean, firm face, and by how elevated her behavior is getting and how loud her voice is getting. They don't recognize those things. Their facial expression is just the same. And so that's certainly an indicator there. This child is having real difficulty with interacting with somebody so much and in reading somebody else's even nonverbal communication, that he's missing this very important piece here. These are also kids who have kind of a flat affect, and that would be a kid that a mom might say to you something like, maybe you're asking something as a therapist about social game participation, and you'll say, well, how do you do with little games like peekaboo or little games like patty cake? How do you do? And mom might say, those just never stuck. Like, I tried those things, but he didn't like it, so I just quit doing it. That's flat affect. That's that a kid, it takes a long time to get a response out of them. Now, is that a kid with autism will never smile or respond to his parents? Absolutely not. That's not what I'm saying here. I'm just saying that there's just the differences in where a kid is versus a kid that just has a speech language delay, or a kid who's typically developing. They love those little games. Their moms didn't have to try too hard to get them to want to participate and to want to play over and over again. So can you see how a mom with a kid who's going to be diagnosed with autism, she didn't get rewarded for her attempt. She didn't get those big smiles back. She didn't get that back and forth reciprocal engagement that's so motivating to parents, that just make you want to do it again and again and again and again. And so we can't fault parents there, because their child's system, again, wired differently. He's not going to respond. And so then the parents stop trying. Pardon me. And so that's certainly something that you might not have thought about as flat affect. So I hope that's something you'll recognize in the future. We've already said this over and over and over. We're talking about nonverbal communication. A lot of times kids with a speech language delay, especially if their motor systems are typically developing, there are no issues with motor delays, they will use gestures and they will use their little bodies as compensation for what they can't say. And so in this situation, when a kid's not using nonverbal communication, parents and adults are doing all the heavy lifting, because they're sometimes the child, he's tall enough to be 2, his little body looks like it's 2, but honestly, communicatively, he's like an infant, because he's not really initiating, he's not really using, again, even these nonverbal things that we've talked about with the gestures, or even his eye contact, and his eye gaze to redirect those things. And so that's certainly a way that we can look at that. All right, the 7th sign here would be delays and differences in language development. And here's what we need to think about. It's not just the talking piece, not just expressive language, but many, many times kids with autism also have differences in language comprehension, or receptive language delays or disorders is what we would call that. Now let me just go ahead and kind of address this delay disorder. I've already talked about delay. A delay is when a kid his milestones are coming in, he's learning new things, but it's just slow. So all that's different there is just the time. It's just taking him a lot longer to learn something than other kids who are not struggling with language development. A kid with autism, really, you'll see delays in that these milestones aren't coming in, but they also have disordered behaviors that we're seeing too, or disordered quirks. So we're seeing extra things, or we might see splinter skills. So with a kid with language development, let's say he can count to 100 or he understands, again, I had a little boy one time that I worked with that his parents said, watch this, and they put out a set of 1 to 100 flashcards on the floor, and Dad could say, go get 57, go get 86, and this is a kid who's 3. Should kids be able to do that when they're 3? No, that was a splinter skill for him. Now, is it a strength? Absolutely. I mean, we are never going to just downplay any kind of developmental strength or academic strength, visual strength that a child would have. But at the same time, it's not really expected. It's atypical. And so while that's a strength, it's still, again, not what we would expect to see. So we'll see that more in autism. There will be things that we don't expect to see that we do, and things that we should see that we don't. And for a better explanation of that, watch or listen to show 1000, because I talk about that a lot in that podcast, and I don't want to keep talking about it here, but that's certainly something that we should tease out. So what are the differences in kids with language development with autism? Well, a lot of times they'll have receptive language differences. Now let's talk about that. What's receptive language? It's how much a kid understands. So it's the input piece of language. So a lot of kids with autism, back to that little boy that I was talking about, he could identify those numbers, but he couldn't follow really simple directions. So there was a real mismatch in his level of skill, even with what he understood. And so we'll see some of that where you think, gosh, that just doesn't really, I haven't really seen that pattern before. That doesn't really make sense. That's certainly something we'll see with a kid who will go on to be diagnosed with autism. Another thing that we might see is a kid who says more than he understands. So this would be our little friends who are echolalic. And so they're talking, but they're not really communicating. So they may be able to count. They may be able to say colors. They may be able to sing a song. That little girl that I was talking to you about before, that little girl that I love so much, who went on to be diagnosed with autism, she could sing Happy Birthday in 3 languages, but she could not ask for something that she wanted. And so there was a real mismatch there. And she, on her test, and a lot of kids with autism, when you do their initial evaluations or assessments, their expressive score is well above what their receptive score is. But that's because a lot of times we're giving them credit for expressive language that's really echolalic or really just well rehearsed, and they're not using it as functionally as they should. And so those are the kinds of differences that we'll see in kids with autism. So I want you to be careful of that. All right, the 8th sign, early sign of autism, is repetitive and restrictive behaviors. Now, this isn't something that the NIH or the CDC mentioned, but it's something that's included on the DSM-5, which is the official diagnostic criteria for autism, which is what any kind of developmental pediatrician or psychologist or whoever is the professional in your area, or the team, which is the best way to really diagnose or rule out autism. It's certainly something they're going to use, and a lot of times it's not in some of the information that parents might access on the internet, but it's something they're concerned about. So they may say, I want to ask you about this hand flapping that he does. Or I want to ask you about, my daughter smells everything. She's embarrassed me before because she'll just go up and try to smell people. She's just trying to smell their pants, or she'll try to smell, and they'll give these examples, and these are the things that we really need to spot as therapists. And sometimes we go into that every kid is different, or every child has its own little quirks, and that is true. But when we start to see these restrictive, repetitive behaviors, we know that's part of autism. So that's certainly something that we should be talking about with parents. So let me give you some examples. What are highly restricted fixated interests? And again, this is straight from the official diagnostic criteria for ASD, or autism spectrum disorder. It would be when kids like things and want to do things that are abnormal in intensity or focus. So that means they're obsessed with it. That's why it's called fixation. So a strong attachment to something that they just love, or a preoccupation with unusual objects. So you might see a kid who's kind of obsessed with a vacuum cleaner, and I've had that happen with a little boy. I mean, he wanted to sleep by it. He would try, when he moved into a big boy bed from the crib, he wanted it in his bed. His parents would see him trying to lift the vacuum cleaner up into his bed. And so when you see those things and you think, or when you have a kid that's just, maybe, we already used Thomas the Train, which is kind of the classic example that therapists and other pediatric professionals use when a kid is so obsessed with Thomas, because they really like the visual buzz that they get when they watch those 4 little wheels spin, usually as they're on their tummies on the floor, rolling it back and forth. Those kinds of things, when it's hard to take something away from a child, and when you can't get it away from them, when you have to just rip it from their hands and then they cry for 2 hours, which we're going to talk about next, that's a marker that it's gone beyond what we would see with a typical toddler kind of phase. And we'll see that with toddlers and preschoolers. They like things, but guess what? Then they like something else just as more, and they just as much or even more, and they kind of forget about the first thing, and they kind of move from thing to thing. That would be more typical for a preschooler to do. Let's say she's watched a Disney movie, but then she wants the Disney doll, and then she wants the dress that goes with it, and then she wants the shoes, and then she wants the crown. That's normal. They've expanded their interest. A lot of times kids with autism, they're so restricted. It's that one toy, and you can't do a lot to add to it. Now, a lot of times kids with autism will they're beyond that. They might like a horse, but guess what? Then they want to hoard 35 plastic horses that you cannot touch, even if your life depends on it, because they're going to stop you from that, because that's how fascinated they are with that particular toy. So certainly kids with autism, that's a marker for that. Let's talk about these other repetitive restrictive interests. These would be what therapists call self-stims. And that's what I alluded to before when I said when a mom might say, look, she's flapping her hands a lot. And moms, a lot of times they think that's just their own child, again, specific to their own child. And you might hear, I heard a grandmother, and this was when I first started working with kids way back in the 90s, and she would say, he's just, he's a little angel. He's just going to fly away with his little angel wings. And those kinds of things are endearing to their grandparents. And guess what? They might be endearing to me too if I didn't really know about self-stims. And again, I'm not being derogatory or trying to offend anyone or anything like that, but a lot of times parents recognize this is what other kids don't do, especially like his response when he sees something that he likes. Laura, he's on his toes. He's just got his face an inch from the screen, and his mouth is wide open, and he's just flapping. That would be something that a parent might be concerned about, and that they're talking with you about, how can I break that? How can I get him to stop? And that's when you're going to talk about self-stimulatory behaviors and how common they are in kids with autism. Now, we typically see 3 kinds of self-stims, and I'm just going to run through this really quick, but we'll see repetitiveness in how kids talk. So that would be repetitive speech, how they move their bodies, or how they use objects. So repetitive speech, that's going to be echolalia. That's what we talked about, parroting or directly copying what they hear from other people, and it's out of context. So it's not that you say to them, Jimmy, you love your book, Brown Bear. You say that book for Mama. Come on, you say it with me. Brown Bear. And you get them started, and then they can do the whole book. That is completely different than a kid who would just randomly start to quote that and roam about the room with no eye contact, not looking for a response from you at all. It's just purely internal. They're doing their own little monologue there for their own stimulation there. That's why it's called self-stimulatory behavior. So it might be, again, a kind of echolalia. It might be jargon. They just talk. You can't understand them, but it's not directed to anybody. So a kid with a speech-language delay might use jargon too, and we want them to, because that is a piece of typical language development. But guess what? It's directed to you. So they're looking at you going, blah, 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 however their jargon is. I can never do it. But they do that with you, but it's communicative. You can't understand them, but they are directing it right to you. And so that would be a difference in typical jargon and typical language development, or even delayed language development, versus a kid who would do it with autism because there's no communication or they're not expecting a response from you, and then they do it a lot. And again, it's for their own internal benefit there. It's not communicative. It might be rote language. We already talked about frequent counting or singing rather than using words. They just walk around all day. It might be a kid who does that maybe in Spanish. Uno, dos, tres. Uno, dos, tres. Uno, dos, tres. He says it all day long, and it's kind of ritualistic. And so that's when it's kind of moved over to this stimming. Other things that parents might not recognize as repetitive speech would be things like humming, grunting, blowing, Or, it's just a verbalization the kid's doing, but he does it all the time. That frequency and intensity piece is there. So you talk with a parent about that, or you recognize that as a professional. And then a kid who might have perseverative speech. So that's the kind of speech where he repeats the same thing, like we said, with the uno, dos, tres, uno, dos, tres, uno, dos, tres, over and over and over. They seem kind of stuck. All right, the next kind of stem is repetitive body movements. We talked about this. Hand flapping, rocking, toe walking is a big one that we'll see in kids with autism, picking at their skin, or any kind of unusual body posturing or body movements. I worked with a little girl that anytime I sat on the floor with her and played and she liked what we did, she would just throw her legs up in a big V. I mean, she looked like a little cheerleader kind of trying to do a little toe touch jump, but she wasn't off the ground. That's an unusual body posture. Now, will we see other toddlers do these kinds of things? Yes, but like I said, the intensity and the frequency is not there. Also, the last kind of stem here is that repetitive object use. And this is a big one that parents will report, but they don't really realize that it's not what other kids do. So kids who might line up toys rather than play, kids who spin toys, kids who obsessively open and close the same door over and over and over, or kids who hoard a toy or fidget with something or hold on to it rather than using that object or toy functionally. So we have to look at that, and we know that kids with autism will have a lot more of that. And again, we look at that intensity and that frequency rather than anything else. All right, sign number 8 here is going to be differences in emotional regulation. Now, I could have done a whole show on this piece, and I think that I will. But I want to go ahead and show this information and share this information with you today. The CDC has put out some really concrete data that we can use that will separate a normal toddler temper tantrum from a kid who is having real differences in emotional regulation. And a kid might have sensory processing differences, which we'll see a lot with kids in autism. And we won't always say that a kid who has these difficulties will go on and get an autism diagnosis. But again, this is worth evaluating. And on the second page of your handout, I've given you that data. We're just going to run through that here. But it would be when a kid has more than 10 to 20 discrete tantrum episodes on separate days at home during a 30-day period. So more days than not, or half the days, or a third of the days, he's got a bad temper tantrum. And again, it would be one that lasts more than 25 minutes on average. So duration is a big marker. And I'm sure that you as a therapist have had that with kids. Even though you've had it during sessions, they get set off and you can't get them back for the whole rest of the session. You have kids that when that starts, you want to say to mom, it's over. I'm not going to be able to, and we don't want to do that, because certainly we want to be able to show parents how to use some calming strategies and show them how to help bring a child out of that. But for all practical purposes, we're not going to get anything accomplished today other than learning how to help mom learn which is important. Really important, learn how to kind of head this off or help this decrease in intensity. So those kinds of things. When a child is unable to calm himself or herself and frequently requires assistance from a caregiver, that's like a newborn. That's like an infant. And so that's the developmental difference here. And so we want kids to develop that we call it capacity for self-regulation. Regardless of how mad they're getting, we want them to learn how to recover and it be over. And kids with autism have a hard time with that. When we also see lots of aggression with a toddler temper tantrum, and all toddlers, even typically developing toddlers and toddlers with speech language delay, will have a lot of tantrums because they can't express themselves and they're so frustrated. But again, there's that quantitative difference there, because sometimes they're looking at you to see, am I getting a response? Or if you give them what they want, it's over. They're great. The tears dry up and the sun comes out and all is right with the world. But it doesn't always happen with a kid with autism. Even if you gave them what they wanted, they might still be upset. And so that's where a tantrum crosses over to a meltdown. And a meltdown is just where a kid has lost the ability to regulate. He can't control it. And the only real ways to handle a meltdown, usually it's removal from that situation. So you have to change rooms, do something completely different. Whatever was causing that initial meltdown, let's say you turned off the screen, you might have to leave the house before he's going to calm down, or he has to just kind of cry it out and fall asleep. And that information is from understood.org. They've got some great information about how to differentiate meltdowns from tantrums. So if you've never looked at that, that would be something else. One other marker about these tantrums with kids who will go on to be diagnosed with autism, their responses are exaggerated compared to what event happened, or sometimes it's even without a clear pattern or trigger, but sometimes it's just, they can't get the puzzle piece to fit and they fall apart. And that's just an exaggerated response, because even a kid with a speech language delay would know to do trial and error, and it would not upset him to the degree he's not going to be like a kid with autism may have a pretty severe response to that, might throw himself back in the chair, or if he can't get it in, or somehow you say, oh, that's too hard, I'm going to take the puzzle away, and then he completely falls apart. He just loses it because he doesn't even have what was making him so upset. And so look at that degree that kids would have there, because that certainly would be for a lot of kids that go on to be diagnosed with autism, an early sign. So let's review these 8 early signs of autism that we talked about today, just to be sure that you as a therapist are mastering this material like we talked about. And remember what I said, we want you as a professional to be able to spot this in kids pretty early on. So you need to commit this list to memory. So let's see if I can do it. I don't know if I can. This might be a bad test for me. I'm not even going to do it. I'm just going to run through it so you can hear it. But eye contact and eye gaze, responding to their own names, pointing to or showing an object of interest. Again, we're looking at these as don'ts. When a kid doesn't have maintain and make eye contact or eye gaze, when a kid doesn't respond to his own name, when a kid doesn't use pointing or showing somebody else an object of interest, when a kid isn't using pretend play by the time he turns 2, when a kid's not imitating sounds or words by 16 to 18 months, when a kid's not using a lot of gestures by 16 months, and then when we see real differences in language development, even compared to kids who just have a speech language delay. And remember, we talked about if it's just slow, and if it's just slow talking, that is completely different than a kid with autism, because he's going to have all these other differences in his social skills and his ability to understand and process language like we talked about, and then the other factors that we mentioned. And then we talked about that emotional regulation piece, their tantrums. They may have a lot more meltdowns where you just cannot help them regulate. They've got to cry it out, fall asleep, or those tantrums last forever. And then the other thing we talked about were the self-stimulatory behaviors. So those things, that's actually 9. Those 9 indicators are things that we look at as early signs of autism. And so we should certainly be able to recognize those things and talk about those things and explain those things to parents and other team members so that they are seeing the same kinds of things that we see when we are working with their children. All right, so let's end this show with some good news. What can we do when we spot a child who has these early signs of autism? You can't just work on talking. You can't just work on the expressive language piece and think everything else is going to fall into place. You've got to look at these other areas. And again, I gave you some good ideas for what we would be looking at when we talked about the social skills and receptive language skills, but there are actually 12 pretty important factors or areas of development that we should be addressing when we are looking at toddlers and preschoolers with autism. And I have done that work for you and outlined it in my therapy manual, the Autism Workbook. So if you are a parent and you are concerned about your child and you're thinking, I want to get on this, I am worried about this, my kid has several of these markers, that book will help you. I've got great checklists in there where you can just go down the list. There's some great worksheets where you can answer questions about your child, and then you at home can begin to take action today to make things different in your child's life. If you're a therapist, you already recognize the importance of these kinds of tools that you can use to be more effective, so that you've got yourself some great lists and some great tools that you can share with parents here. So I wanted to direct your attention to that resource. The link will be listed there in the post if you want to scroll down below the video. If you are listening to the podcast, you can go to my website at teachmetotalk and look for the Autism Workbook and get more information about that great resource for you there. All right, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe. That's it for today. I am so thankful and grateful that you joined me for this podcast. I love doing these shows, and again, I'm so grateful I get the opportunity to do it. My name's Laura Mize, and you've just watched Teach Me to Talk's podcast. Thanks so much.